educated woman who had dared to read scripture in her native tongue, she now faced accusations that would lead her through every horror the Spanish Inquisition had perfected. Her story, preserved in meticulous records, provides a window into a machinery of terror that specifically targeted women who stepped beyond their prescribed boundaries. The Spanish Inquisition in the autumn of 1559, Maria de Bohores stood before the Inquisitorial Tribunal in Seville, established in 1478 by Ferdinand and Isabella, quickly evolved from a tool of religious conformity into an instrument of gendered oppression. While men certainly suffered under its judgments, women faced unique vulnerabilities. They could not legally defend themselves. Their testimony held less weight than men's, and the nature of their accusations often centered on crimes only women could commit. Witchcraft linked to female sexuality, heretical practices connected to domestic spaces, and the corruption of children through mother's milk tainted by false belief. The arrest always came at dawn. Inquisitorial guards knew that darkness amplified terror, that women taken from their beds while children screamed, and husbands stood powerless, created maximum psychological impact. Maria de Bohores was dragged from her home as neighbors watched from behind shuttered windows, learning through her example the price of intellectual curiosity. Her books were burned in the street, her property immediately confiscated. Her children left to wonder if they would ever see their mother again. The journey to the inquisitorial prison began the torture long before any formal interrogation. Women were transported in open carts, displayed as warnings to others. Crowds threw refuse and stones blessed by priests, who assured them that violence against heretics was holy work. By the time Maria reached the prison, her dignity was already under assault, her identity transforming from respected widow to accused heretic. The cells of the Inquisition were designed as instruments of psychological destruction. No light penetrated the stone walls except what leaked through the door's Judas hole. The silence was absolute except for distant screams that served as preview of coming attractions. Women spent months in these tombs, their sanity eroding in darkness while they waited for interrogations that might never come. The uncertainty itself was torture, not knowing the charges, the evidence, or even the day of the week. When interrogation finally came, it followed patterns refined over decades of practice. The inquisitors, educated men who saw themselves as physicians of the soul, approached women with a mixture of paternalism and contempt. They believed females were naturally weaker, more susceptible to Satan's influence, and therefore required special methods to extract truth. The questioning began gently, almost kindly, offering chances for voluntary confession, but behind the inquisitors, always visible, stood the instruments that would be employed if words failed. The Spanish Inquisition had inherited medieval torture techniques, but refined them into a science. Manuals specified exact procedures, documenting which tortures produced which types of confessions. The goal was not death, but submission. Broken bodies that would confess publicly, validating the Inquisition's authority. Women's bodies, already considered dangerous and polluting in medieval theology, became laboratories where pain was calibrated to produce maximum suffering without martyrdom. The economic dimension cannot be ignored. The Inquisition funded itself through confiscated property, creating incentives to target wealthy widows and successful merchant women. Maria Deborah had inherited substantial property from her late husband, property that would fund months of inquisitorial operations. The intersection of gender, wealth, and religious suspicion made certain women irresistible targets. The strappado was often the first formal torture applied, its simplicity hiding sophisticated cruelty. Maria de Bohores would have been taken to a chamber where ropes hung from ceiling pulleys like noose waiting for necks. The process began with ritual humiliation. She was stripped to her shift, her hair bound up to expose her neck, her dignity systematically destroyed before the physical pain began. The torturer, often a layman employed specifically for this purpose, would tie her wrists behind her back with rough rope that cut into skin. The rope was attached to the pulley system, And then with mechanical precision, Maria would be hoisted into the air. Her entire body weight, approximately 130 lb, would suddenly hang from shoulders, twisted backward into an anatomically impossible position. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Both shoulders would dislocate within seconds, the ball joints tearing free from sockets with audible pops. Muscles designed to pull were suddenly forced to support entire body weight in extension. Nerves stretched beyond capacity, sending signals of agony that consumed all thought. Contemporary accounts describe women screaming until their throats bled, though the Inquisition's records merely note the prisoner expressed discomfort. But the basic strap was just the beginning. Weights would be attached to Maria's feet, starting with 25 lb, increasing to 50, then 100. Each addition multiplied the damage exponentially. The shoulders, already dislocated, would begin to tear free from the body entirely. The spine would compress and stretch simultaneously, creating damage that would last lifetime. Some women reported feeling their arms beginning to separate from their torsos, held only by skin and sinew. The jerking variation inflicted even greater trauma. Maria would be hoisted to the ceiling, then dropped suddenly, only to be stopped with a jerk just before her feet touched ground. This whiplash effect could tear arms completely from sockets, destroy the delicate structure, ease of the spine, and cause internal injuries that would kill slowly over days or weeks. The technique was reserved for those who maintained innocence, despite standard strappado sessions. Throughout the torture, a notary recorded everything with bureaucratic precision. Each scream was documented, each plea transcribed, each confession carefully noted with the exact time it was obtained. These records, preserved in archives, reveal the systematic nature of the torture. Women like Maria would initially maintain innocence, then begin offering small confessions, eventually admitting to anything suggested, just to make the pain stop. The inquisitors understood the psychology of progressive torture. After an hour of strappado, Maria would be lowered and asked to confirm her confession. If she recanted, claiming the confession was forced, the torture would resume. This cycle could continue for days, with rest periods calculated to allow just enough recovery to ensure survival for more torture. The goal was to break not just the body but the will, creating confessions that would be maintained even after the torture ended. Maria de Bohorus endured 3 sessions of strappado over 2 weeks. The records note that she confessed to reading prohibited books, discussing theology with other women, and questioning the authority of the church. What the records don't capture is that she never walked properly again, never could lift her arms above her shoulders, never could hold her grandchildren without pain shooting through her destroyed joints. The iron spider represented a specifically gendered form of torture designed exclusively for women's bodies. When Maria de Bohorez continued to minimize her crimes despite the strappado, the inquisitors turned to this device that attacked both flesh and female identity. The spider was brought out with ceremony, heated in braziers until the metal glowed, filling the chamber with the smell of hot iron that would forever trigger panic in survivors. The device consisted of sharp iron claws that could be heated to searing temperatures. Unlike other tortures that were theoretically gender-neutral, the spider was applied exclusively to breasts, targeting the physical markers of womanhood. The symbolism was deliberate. Women accused of nursing heretical beliefs would have their capacity to nurse literally torn away. The breast, symbol of motherhood and feminine nurture, became the site of ultimate violation. The ritual of application was carefully orchestrated psychological torture. Maria would be restrained on a table, her upper body exposed, while male guards, torturers, and inquisitors observed. The heated spider would be held close enough for her to feel its heat to understand what was coming. This anticipation, sometimes lasting an hour or more, often broke women who had withstood other tortures. The imagination of coming pain proved as powerful as pain itself. When applied, the heated claws would simultaneously burn and penetrate, creating wounds that combined multiple types of agony. The metal would sear nerve endings while tearing through tissue, creating damage that would never fully heal. The spider would then be slowly pulled away, ripping flesh in a controlled manner that maximized pain while avoiding immediately fatal damage. Women described the sensation as having their essence as females literally torn from their bodies. The psychological impact exceeded even the physical trauma. In a society where women's values centered on their roles as wives and mothers, the deliberate mutilation of breasts constituted identity destruction. Many survivors reported feeling they were no longer truly women after the spider's application. Some could never nurse children, others were rejected by husbands who saw them as damaged, and all carried scars that marked them as women who had been tortured by the Inquisition. The spider was particularly used against women accused of sexual crimes, adultery linked to heresy, fornication with devils, or the sexual aspects of witchcraft allegations. The inquisitors created a logic where the punishment matched the crime, where women who had allegedly used their sexuality for evil would have that sexuality literally torn away. This revealed the deep sexual anxieties underlying much of the Inquisition's persecution of women. Contemporary accounts from physicians who examined spider victims describe horrific damage, massive scarring, chronic infections, and permanent disfigurement. Many women developed what would now be recognized as complex regional pain syndrome, experiencing burning agony. Years after the torture, the spider's wounds were designed to heal slowly, keeping victims in pain for months while preventing the death that would end their suffering, and their use as examples. The rack or potro transformed the human body into an instrument of its own destruction. When Maria Deborah Hawes refused to name accomplices despite previous tortures, she was brought to this device that would systematically disassemble her body's structural integrity. The Spanish rack had been refined from its medieval predecessors into a precise instrument that could maintain victims at the exact threshold between agony and death. The device dominated torture chambers, a wooden frame with rollers at each end, leather straps, and windlasses that created mechanical advantage, allowing one man to tear apart a human body with minimal effort. Maria would be laid on the frame, leather straps attached to wrists and ankles, additional bonds across her chest and thighs, ensuring no movement was possible. Her hair would be tied to the frame, preventing any head movement that might provide relief. The initial positioning was carefully calculated. The body would be stretched just enough to remove all slack, creating discomfort, but not immediate pain. At this stage, many women broke, understanding what was coming and choosing confession over the inevitable agony. Maria held firm, perhaps still believing her influential friends might intervene. She would learn that the rack recognized no social distinctions. As the windlasses turned, Maria's body began its transformation. First, the sensation of muscles stretching beyond their design limits. Thousands of microfibers tearing in a cascade of pain signals. Then joints began to separate. Fingers first, then wrists, elbows, shoulders. The spine, that crucial architecture of human uprightness, would begin to elongate, spaces appearing between vertebrae. Hip joints would start their slow dislocation, followed by knees and ankles. The human body was never meant to be 6 in longer than its natural height. The rack's operators were skilled professionals who understood anatomy. They knew that turning the windlass 1/4 rotation might separate joints without full dislocation, maintaining the victim in unbearable anticipation of the final destructive turn. They could keep Maria suspended in this pre-dislocation agony for hours, her body trembling with the effort of holding itself together against mechanical forces that would inevitably win. The sounds the rack produced were as traumatic as the pain. Witnesses described the pop of separating joints, the crack of cartilage tearing, the wet sound of muscles ripping from bone. These sounds carried through prison walls, ensuring other prisoners understood what awaited them. Maria's screams would join a chorus that echoed through the Inquisition's chambers. Each voice, a lesson to others about the price of resistance. Between stretching sessions, Maria would be questioned. The inquisitors wanted names. Who else read forbidden books? Which women gathered to discuss theology? Who questioned church authority? The rack was particularly effective at producing accusations against others as victims desperately offered names to stop their bodies from being torn apart. These extracted accusations would trigger new arrests, creating chains of persecution that could destroy entire communities of educated women. The pair of anguish embodied the Inquisition's ability to inflict invisible torture that left no external marks while destroying women from within. When Maria de Bohores proved resistant to external tortures, maintaining that her confessions were limited to personal failings rather than organized heresy, the inquisitors turned to this device that would violate her internally where no witness could observe the damage. The pair was an iron device shaped like its namesake fruit when closed, consisting of 4 segments that could be expanded by turning a screw. Different sizes existed for different orifices: mouth, vagina, and anus, with the chosen location corresponding to the alleged crime. For Maria, accused of speaking heresy, the oral version would be employed, though the threat of other applications hung heavy in the torture chamber's air. The insertion itself constituted assault. Maria would be held down while the cold metal was forced into her mouth, the taste of iron mixing with terror. The initial position was merely uncomfortable, the closed pair filling her mouth, but not preventing breathing through her nose. But as the screw began to turn, the segments would slowly separate, stretching her jaw beyond its natural capacity, pressing against teeth, palate, and throat. The expansion continued incrementally, each turn of the screw precisely calibrated. The corners of Maria's mouth would begin to tear, blood running down her throat. Her jaw joints would strain, then begin to dislocate. Teeth might crack under pressure. The soft tissues of her mouth would stretch and tear. Breathing became difficult as the expanding metal pressed against her airway. Panic would mix with pain as suffocation threatened. The pair's particular cruelty lay in its invisibility. Unlike external tortures that left obvious marks, the pair's damage was hidden inside the body. Maria could be displayed at her auto-da-fe looking relatively intact, while suffering from internal injuries that would never heal. She might never eat solid food again, never speak without pain, never swallow without remembering the metal's expansion in her throat. For women accused of sexual crimes, the pair took on even more horrific dimensions. A vaginal insertion was used against those accused of fornication with devils or sexual aspects of witchcraft. These applications caused massive internal trauma, tearing of vaginal walls, damage to the cervix and uterus, injuries that would make intercourse impossible, and pregnancy deadly. The Inquisition thus ensured that women accused of sexual crimes would never again be able to engage in sexuality, even within marriage. The psychological impact of the pair exceeded its physical damage. The violation of internal spaces, the loss of bodily integrity from within, created dissociative states that many never recovered from. Women reported feeling that their bodies had become alien territories, violated in ways that destroyed their sense of self. The internal nature of the damage meant they carried invisible wounds that no one else could see or understand. The judgment chair stood in the torture chamber, like a throne of thorns, its surface bristling with hundreds of iron spikes. When Maria de Bohores continued to protect other women despite previous tortures, she was brought before this device that would make sitting that most basic human position into prolonged agony. The chair represented the Inquisition's understanding that sometimes the simplest tortures were the most effective. The chair's construction was precisely engineered. Between 500 and 1,500 spikes of varying lengths covered every surface, seat, back, armrests, and footrest. The spikes were long enough to penetrate skin and muscle, but not so long as to reach vital organs. The spacing ensured that the victim's weight could never be evenly distributed, guaranteeing that specific pressure points would bear unbearable force. Maria would be stripped and slowly lowered onto the spikes, while inquisitors explained that her suffering could end immediately with full confession. The initial contact created hundreds of puncture wounds simultaneously, each individually bearable, but collectively overwhelming. Blood would begin to seep immediately, though never enough to cause rapid death. The chair was designed to torture, not kill, at least not quickly. Iron bands would lock around Maria's wrists and ankles, preventing any movement that might provide relief. Additional straps across her chest and thighs ensured complete immobilization. She could not shift position, could not ease pressure on any single spike, could not do anything but endure as her body weight drove the spikes deeper with each passing minute. The human instinct to adjust position, to seek comfort, became its own torture as her body betrayed her with involuntary movements that only increased pain. The chair's torture operated on multiple timescales. First came the immediate pain of penetration. Then, as hours passed, the wounds would begin to swell, increasing pressure on the spikes. Blood pooling in the lower extremities would cause additional swelling. Muscle cramps from immobilization would add another layer of agony. Eventually, infection would set in, creating fever that the inquisitors interpreted as demons leaving the body. The integration of fire elevated the chair's horror. Braziers placed beneath the seat would slowly heat the metal, turning the spikes into burning needles. The heat would build gradually, first warming, then uncomfortable, then painful, finally unbearable. Maria would feel her flesh cooking where it touched metal, the smell of burning skin filling the chamber. The heated metal would cauterize wounds even as it created them, preventing blood loss while maximizing pain. Some versions of the chair included additional refinements. Spikes on the armrests were positioned to penetrate the sensitive areas of the inner arms. The footrests' spikes were angled to prevent any weight distribution through the legs. Some chairs had adjustable backs that could be tilted, changing pressure points and preventing any adaptation to the pain. The Inquisition had transformed sitting into a craft of cruelty. The tokai, the Inquisition's water torture, transformed the essential element of life into an instrument of suffocation. Maria de Bohorus, her body already broken by previous tortures, faced this method that would make her feel she was drowning while never leaving dry land. The water torture left no visible marks, allowing the Inquisition to claim mercy while inflicting psychological trauma that would last lifetimes. The preparation was ritualistic. Maria would be bound to an inclined table with her head lower than her feet, causing blood to rush to her brain. This position alone created disorientation and panic. Her mouth would be forced open with an iron device, sometimes the same pair used in other contexts. A cloth, the toa that gave the torture its name, would be placed over her face, covering nose and mouth. Water would then be poured slowly from a height, soaking the cloth until it conformed to Maria's face like a suffocating mask. As water continued to pour, it would force its way into her nostrils and mouth, triggering the drowning reflex. Her body would convulse with the need to breathe, while the soaked cloth made breathing impossible. The sensation was of drowning in reverse, water entering rather than lungs seeking air. The Inquisitors had developed precise protocols. Water was measured in jars with different amounts prescribed for different levels of resistance. Maria might endure 6 jars in her first session, 8 in the second, 12 if she continued to protect others. Between each jar, she would be questioned, gasping for air while knowing another round was coming. The anticipation became its own torture. The physical effects were severe despite the lack of visible injury. Water entering the sinuses created intense pain and lasting damage. The repeated triggering of the drowning reflex could cause cardiac arrhythmias. Some women inhaled water into their lungs, developing pneumonia that killed them days after the torture. The psychological impact, the permanent association of water with death, meant many survivors could never again wash their faces without panic. The toa was particularly cruel when applied to pregnant women. The Inquisition claimed to protect unborn children, but the water torture could trigger miscarriage through the violent convulsions it caused. Women who lost pregnancies during torture were then accused of deliberately killing their children to prevent them from being raised in the true faith. Their grief became evidence of guilt. After months of torture, Maria de Jorquez faced her final ordeal, the auto de fe, the public ceremony where the Inquisition displayed its power through choreographed humiliation and execution. These spectacles, attended by thousands and lasting entire days, transformed individual suffering into collective instruction. Maria would learn that her torture had been private, her breaking would be public. The preparation began the night before with the procession of the Green Cross. Guards would move through the prison, informing prisoners of their sentences. Maria learned she would be relaxed to the secular arm, the euphemism for burning at the stake. She spent her last night listening to priests who urged confession, promising that repentance would earn her the mercy of strangulation before burning. Pride or faith, we cannot know which made her refuse. At dawn, Maria was dressed in the sambito, a yellow garment painted with flames pointing upward, indicating her sentence. The carroza, a pointed cap similarly decorated, completed her transformation from individual to symbol. These garments were designed to be seen from great distances, ensuring everyone in the crowd understood her fate, she was, as no longer Maria de Bajores, but simply the heretic, her identity erased beneath standardized markers of condemnation. The procession to the plaza followed routes designed for maximum exposure. Maria, weakened by months of torture, was forced to walk barefoot through streets lined with spectators. Those too, damaged to walk, were carried in chairs or dragged, their broken bodies displayed as evidence of the Inquisition's power. The crowd threw stones in refuge, their violence blessed by priests who assured them that tormenting heretics was holy work. The ceremony itself was elaborate theater. A massive scaffold dominated the plaza with platforms for inquisitors, secular authorities, and the condemned. Maria stood for hours as sermons were preached about the dangers of heresy, the mercy of the Church, and the justice of her sentence. Her confessions, extracted through torture, were read aloud with embellishments that maximized humiliation. The crowd heard not just of her reading forbidden books, but of elaborate sexual crimes and devil worship that existed only in her torturers' imaginations. The journey from scaffold to stake was Maria's last walk. Some condemned broke at this point, offering desperate confessions in exchange for strangulation. Others, like Maria, maintained silence or proclaimed innocence. The crowd's mood could shift, sometimes baying for blood, sometimes moved to uncomfortable pity by the sight of broken women walking to their deaths. The Inquisitor's paw preferred the former, as sympathy for heretics was itself suspicious. At the stake, Maria was chained to a post at top, a platform that ensured visibility to the entire plaza. The fire was built to burn slowly, green wood that would smoke before igniting, prolonging the agony. As flames began to rise, some witnesses reported that Maria began to pray, though whether to the Inquisitor's God or her own understanding of divinity, none could say. Her screams carried across the city, joining the chorus of suffering that marked every auto da fe. Not every woman who entered the Inquisition's machinery died there. Some survived through confession, others through influence, and a few through sheer resilience that defied their torturers' expectations. These survivors carried testimonies that, despite official suppression, preserved crucial records of what occurred within torture chambers. Their accounts reveal not just horror, but also resistance, adaptation, and the limits of even the Inquisition's power. Isabella Duna represented one path to survival: strategic confession. Arrested for Judaizing in 1561, she quickly understood that complete denial meant death, while complete confession meant implicating others. She developed a careful strategy, admitting to personal practices while claiming ignorance of their heretical nature. She performed expected female weakness, fainting during mild questioning to avoid harsher torture. Her confessions were detailed enough to satisfy yet vague enough to protect others. The physical aftermath of torture created lifelong challenges. Women emerged from inquisitorial prisons with destroyed joints from the strap, internal injuries from the pear, chronic pain from the rack. They could no longer perform basic tasks. Cooking required hands that could grip. Childcare needed arms that could lift. Survival demanded bodies that functioned. Many became dependent on families who often resented the burden of caring for women whose torture had brought shame and poverty. Economic survival proved equally difficult. The Inquisition's confiscation of property left even acquitted women destitute. The San Benito worn during public penance had to be displayed in parish churches, creating permanent records of accusation. Women found themselves unemployable, unmarriageable, and often homeless. Some survived through begging, others through prostitution. Ironies not lost on those who had been tortured for alleged moral crimes. Psychological adaptation revealed remarkable resilience. Survivors developed what modern psychology would recognize as dissociative techniques, ways of separating mind from body during trauma. They created internal worlds where torture couldn't reach, maintaining sanity through elaborate mental constructions. Some reported experiencing themselves floating above their bodies during torture, watching their own suffering with detached curiosity. Networks of mutual aid operated despite terrible risks. Women who had survived would secretly assist new victims' families, sharing knowledge about which inquisitors might show mercy, which confessions satisfied without triggering demands for accomplices, which tortures could be endured versus those that broke everyone. This underground education in survival, passed between women at markets and wells, created an invisible resistance that helped preserve lives and sanity. Some survivors became secret chroniclers. Luisa de Carvajal, tortured in Mexico City's Inquisition, wrote coded accounts in margins of prayer books. Maria Diaz-Ala hid testimonies in embroidery using traditional women's work to preserve records of torture. These alternative archives, maintained through female networks, the Inquisition didn't recognize as threatening preserved evidence that official records tried to suppress. The Spanish Inquisition officially ended in 1834, but its methods, justifications, and impacts reverberated through subsequent centuries into our present moment. The systematic torture of women under religious authority established patterns that would reappear in different contexts, sometimes with different ideologies, but always with the same fundamental structure of using women's bodies as battlegrounds for power and control. The bureaucratization of torture, pioneered by the Inquisition, became a template for modern authoritarian regimes. The meticulous documentation, the medical supervision ensuring survival for continued torture, the use of confession rather than evidence. These methods reappeared in 20th century dictatorships. The Argentine military's systematic torture of female political prisoners, including pregnant women, echoed inquisitorial practices with disturbing precision. The intersection of sexual violence and ideological persecution established by the Inquisition continues worldwide. Women accused of witchcraft in contemporary Africa and Asia faced tortures remarkably similar to those Maria de Bajoras endured. The accusations using supernatural powers, corrupting communities, threatening social order, remain consistent. The methods, public humiliation, torture, focusing on sexual organs, burning persist across cultures and centuries. Medical complicity in torture, normalized by inquisitorial physicians, established precedents that enabled later atrocities. Nazi doctors who experimented on women, psychiatrists who administered electroshock to cure female independence, modern physicians who perform forced sterilizations, all follow patterns where medical authority serves oppressive power rather than human well-being. The corruption of healing into harm, pioneered during the Inquisition, created templates that continue to enable violence. Legal systems worldwide still reflect inquisitorial influences. The emphasis on confession over evidence, the diminished credibility of women's testimony, the use of past sexual history to undermine accusers. These patterns persist in modern courtrooms. Women reporting sexual violence face interrogations. Echo, inquisitorial questioning, their credibility questioned, their histories examined, their suffering minimized. The destruction of female knowledge networks that occurred during the Inquisition created gaps that persist today. Traditional medicine practiced by women was replaced by male-dominated professional medicine. Female literacy, seen as dangerous, was suppressed for centuries. Women's gatherings, viewed as potential sites of heresy, were discouraged or prohibited. The systematic destruction of female knowledge and community created deficits that societies are still working to repair. Contemporary religious fundamentalism, regardless of specific faith, often replicates inquisitorial patterns. Women who challenge religious authority, who claim spiritual experiences outside approved channels, who assert autonomy over their bodies and minds, face persecution that echoes Maria Deborah's ordeal. The specific religions differ, but the structure, male religious authority controlling female bodies through violence, remains constant. Understanding the Inquisition's torture of women is not merely historical exercise, but urgent contemporary necessity. The patterns established during those centuries of persecution, the intersection of misogyny and ideology, the use of sexual violence as control, the corruption of institutions meant to protect, continue to threaten women worldwide. Maria de Bohorez died in 1559, but women still burn literally and figuratively for the crime of exist. Beyond prescribed boundaries, the Inquisition ultimately failed in its stated goal of creating religious unity through terror. What it succeeded in creating was generational trauma, destroyed knowledge, and templates for persecution that outlived the institution itself. Every woman tortured, every family destroyed, every community terrorized, represented not the triumph of faith, but its corruption into an instrument of power. The devices of torture, the strappado, the rack, the iron spider, the pear, the chair, were not tools of salvation, but weapons of oppression that revealed the depths to which human cruelty could sink when wrapped in the language of the sacred. As we remember Maria de Bohorez and the countless women whose names were erased by their torturers, we must recognize that their suffering was not inevitable or necessary, but chosen by men who placed power over compassion, orthodoxy over humanity, control over justice. Their stories demand not just remembrance, but vigilance against the patterns of persecution that claimed their lives. In a world where women still face violence for reading, thinking, healing, and speaking, the Spanish Inquisition's torture chambers are not safely historical, but dangerously relevant. The last words belong not to the inquisitors who documented torture with bureaucratic precision, but to the women who endured it. Though most of their voices were silenced, some fragments survive. Maria de Bohorez before her execution repos. Artedly said, "I die for reading words that men feared I might understand." In that single sentence lies both the tragedy of her death and the threat she represented. A woman who claimed the right to her own mind, her own faith, her own understanding. That threat which the Inquisition tried to burn away survived the flames. It survives still